August, or we're going to be toast.
No, you see, we had already hired Maureen before that happened.
Yeah, but we hadn't gotten John.
Okay, I know, but I.
Well, let me give you my version.
Okay, I'll hear your version.
So I remember presenting this, and I'm kind of a straightforward guy. I'm not the member of our organization that could really rile the troops up or have the best jokes, but we had those guys. One of our members was a fellow named Marlo Preston. And Marlo was the most prominent and respected lawyer in Austin, Texas. And he had been practicing bankruptcy for 20, 30 years. And I had called Marlo. We divided up some of our members that we thought had big practices in the month before the convention to see if we could cold call for money. And we were coming up pretty dry. And I'd called Marlo, and he said, geez, I can't do anything right now. It was kind of an abstract target we were shooting at. So then we came and gave this presentation. And Marlo took the microphone, and he was down on the floor. And he says, you know, I teach Sunday school at church every Sunday. He says, I'm going to go and talk about the sermon of the day. By the time we finished that meeting, we had raised $80,000.
Yeah.
So we had many people
Yeah.
give their talents
Right.
to give us the resources to hire.
That was the time when John Rayo came on the board from NCLC. He replaced
In Boston.
In Boston, he replaced Gary Klein. He retired, and John.
And that was the National Consumer Law Center, right?
Yes, yes. And so I always tell John that he was really good luck for NACBA, because moments before he was appointed to the board or elected to the board, we were, you know, in deep red, and then he got on the board, and all of a sudden we got a whole bunch of money. So, but anyway, the other thing, I'm going back to '97 when the bill was first introduced. We did something else, and we went around the Hill and we talked, and one of the people that we talked to about the bill was Mark Agrast, who was then working for Bill Delahunt, Congressman Bill Delahunt from Massachusetts. He was a great guy. And Mark was a great guy. And he gave us really the best advice, which is, in order to fight this bill, you can't do it by yourself. Nobody cares about bankruptcy debtors or bankruptcy debtors' attorneys. You're going to have to get other groups to go out there and fight that for you. You're going to get labor unions, consumer groups, you know, whatever. Get all of these groups. We really took it to heart, and we started working on that at that point. And we got the UAW pretty quickly on because of Matt Mason was on the board at the time. And Consumer Federation of America, CFA, they got on board right away. And so this was towards the end of '97. And so we were really starting to work it hard. CFA had a lobbyist, Mary Rouleau, Rouleau. And she was great. She was fantastic. And she was doing a lot of work for us. And she told me, because by then I was the president, she said, Norma, I just can't do this all by myself. You got to hire somebody to help me. So I said, okay, well, tell us who do you suggest? And this was like in February of '98. And so that's when we hired, she gave me a few names, and we interviewed them, and we hired Maureen Thompson of the Hastings Group.
In Arlington, Virginia.
Yeah, in about March, to come on board and to help Mary Rouleau kind of assemble the alliance, the group of allies that we had, and to work, you know, basically work with Mary to try to move this thing forward.
And the Hastings group had a lot of clients in the public policy area, and primarily on the consumer side, advocating school lunch groups that did a lot of work with groups that would have an affinity for bankruptcy debtors.
So then we went to Miami, we made the money, and in the meantime, we found out that John Urowski, who we had come to know, we'd met with him, Suzanne Bingham had introduced us to him.
Let me give the connection on John Urowski. John Urowski.
How do you spell his name?
Y-A-W.
No, Y-A-R-O-W-S-K-Y. Jonathan.
Yeah.
J-O-N.
John Urowski had been working as President Clinton's, one of his counsel.
Special counsel.
John Urowski's job for President Clinton John, I mentioned earlier, was general counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. When the Democrats lost the House, John went to work for the president. And John's job by 95, 96 was vetting nominees to the federal judiciary
And
through
trying to
the
get-
Senate Judiciary Committee.
Yeah, trying to get them
So
confirmed.
that was one of his principal jobs.
So he really familiar with Judiciary Committee.
So on one of our trips back, probably in late '97, we realized that the forces are marshaling up against us look pretty grim. So we talked to Suzanne Bingham and said, Suzanne, you've got to get us somebody in the White House,
Yeah.
because it's not enough just to go to Congress. So she says, well, I know John Urowski. He now works for President Clinton. Let me see if I can get an appointment. She called him up. He agreed to meet with Norma and me, and he was in the old executive office building. And he had piles of I remember walking into the office, and John had like these giant volumes of like you'd find in a monastery of books or research. And we introduced ourselves, and we mentioned that we were from San Jose, and that Don Edwards had been our congressman. And immediately John lit up and he said, Mr. Edwards, since he was a prince. And so then we told him what our problem is. He says, well, I'm not working on bankruptcy. I hear what you're saying. Let me see if I can keep an eye out for this. And I'll
let
do
us
what I
know.
can to help
Let us
you.
know if something happens.
So that happened in September of '97.
Yeah. So then around May or so, we hear that he left the White House and he was going to Patton Boggs. And so we're going, well, darn, now we don't have anybody in the White House. And then we went to Miami, we got the money, boom, hey, maybe we can hire him. So we called him up. I called him up. I did a lot of the legwork on this one, and I said, "We don't have a lot of money here, but could you help us?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, so he agreed to do it on a semi pro bono basis, and he got, I guess, Tommy Boggs' permission to do that. So we paid him, but we didn't pay him very much. And actually, the contract with us, it took him 3 weeks to pass all the conflict checks and stuff. But as I said, Patton Boggs had not yet been hired by the banks, and they were the last remaining. So it was just a fluke that he went to work for them. Well, he's a partner in them. He was. But so anyway, he signed, I think, his agreement with us, even though he was also going to do work for the American Trial Lawyers Association. It was a big one. He had a lot of big clients, but
Well, that was critical.
yeah,
Because
it was
having
critical.
Maureen Thompson to work to build out the coalition so that
Yeah.
we could present our
Yeah.
side
Yeah.
much broader than consumer bankruptcy lawyers and put a face on these consumers. After all,
Right.
they are the AARP members, they are the labor union members, they are minority groups. Another person that really helped us, it just came to my mind, was Wade Henderson
Yeah.
with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights
Yeah.
in Washington.
Yeah.
He was a terrific supporter throughout all of these years. And having Urowski in there, I remember we went back for a meeting in '98. We figured we've got to put together something to deal with this.
What are you talking about? In the summer or what?
Yeah, I think
Well,
so.
no. Okay, so what was happening was, so we hired John in June
Of '98.
Yeah.
of '98. And things were happening really fast.
Well, there had been a congressional hearing, for example.
Yes, in March.
In like February or March, right?
March. Yeah, we testified at that.
Yeah, let's stop and talk about that for a minute. So we were able to get a number of our members to come and testify at the hearings, both in the House and the Senate. And I think you testified.
Did you testify
It was
to
in the
him?
House, yes.
Not for
But
NACBA.
you
but were-
testified in '99.
But I
as
testified
well,
first in '98.
I
Okay,
remember
okay,
a
right.
meeting you were at and John Conyers.
That was at the real Judiciary
Yes.
Committee,
I don't know if
not
it-
a subcommittee at
No,
that time.
that
That was the real
the
committee.
subcommittee of Commercial and Administrative Law, and I had Edith Jones on one side of me,
Yes.
and I had Lloyd Cutler on the other, representing the Financial Services Roundtable.
Right.
And I had just gotten that call
Okay.
on a Friday to be there for the hearing on Tuesday,
Right,
and
right.
to submit my testimony by Monday.
Right.
And all I don't know, I'm not supposed to be the one, I'm not being interviewed.
Yeah, we
here,
should be
Well,
interviewed.
But
Yeah.
I remember that one of the reasons I think that I got asked by David Lockman, who was Congressman Nadler's judicial aide, was because I had done this study of 100 cases in Oakland. Because I was frustrated that there wasn't any talk of hard numbers, and that the Georgetown folks had allegedly put together this study that showed that there were 15% of the people that filed for bankruptcy could afford to pay something back. And
Right.
I said, well, and they wouldn't release the numbers.
Right,
They
right.
would never release the statistics. And so I decided to do my own little study that, I'd done like maybe a month before that. And I had something to talk about then when I got to the, it wasn't just, this is wrong and
Right.
you've got to stop it. It was, well, you're just plain factually wrong, because based upon this, you should look a little more closely. And anyway.
Yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
remember that hearing,
Yeah,
and it was very helpful to have people that weren't bankruptcy debtor lawyers just to say, this is what we're seeing in the court. It's not exactly what you might be hearing from everybody.
Right.
Right.
It was very valuable,
Yeah.
and I particularly remember at that hearing the back and forth between Congressman Conyers and Edith Jones. And
Yeah.
that was wonderful. So I testified at one of the hearings. Norma
I did.
testified at a different hearing on the Senate side.
Matt testified.
Billy Brewer testified in a,
These are all board members.
Right.
that were at the committee hearings in Washington. And,
Were you ever able to meet with creditor representatives, just you and
Yes.
NACBA?
well, it's interesting that you asked that. There were, during the course of the review commission, and usually probably starting in late '97, the ABI conference had brought everybody together. And there was a subgroup of creditor representatives, probably led by Visa's risk management department, and a fellow named Ken Crone. And Ken Crone,
Is it
C-R-O-N-E.
Yes.
Yeah.
H-N, yeah.
And Ken, a very affable gentleman,
Or
and
C-R-O-N-E, was it Crone?
No, I think it was.
With an H in there?
I think
Okay,
so.
yeah.
anyway, very affable gentleman, and always very polite to the
Yeah,
debtor
yeah,
attorneys.
very polite to us.
He said, well, I'm trying to get everybody together and see if we can hash out what really needs to be fixed and what doesn't. And we'd like NACBA to participate at these roundtables. And they would come every 4 or 5 months for the next couple of years. And so our group met and said, well, are we selling out going? And we said, no, we got to go. So we went to the meetings, and we found actually that the groups that they had brought together had people that could talk with each other. And they had creditor lawyers, they had trustees, judges, and we would hash through whether it was what are abuses, what's an abusive filing, what would work, what can everybody live with. And we would find as we went through most of these meetings, there were consensus on most points, not everything, but most points. And at the end of each process, lurking would be DC lobbyists that these same banks had hired to get their bill passed would come to squelch anything coming out of these meetings. So I felt that those independent meetings would give some, I don't want to call it optimism, but they were positive.
And some of those lobbyists would have been people like Phil Corwin.
Yeah.
George Wallace.
George Wallace.
Yes.
Those are the two big ones.
Other lobbyists would come sometimes from car lenders and say, no, you.
So the retail guys.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so they really didn't want this process to amount to anything at the end of the day, because I think they'd been told they had told the bankers, we can get you what you want. You don't need to do any compromise.
Yeah, right.
That was the dynamic.
They invited me for a while, but I guess I was too much of a pain in the ass to them. So.
Well,
It's fine with me not to have to go back and listen to
I
their
think the
crap.
last meeting of that group that I went to was on 9/11.
Yeah.
In 2001, we were all in New Orleans the morning of the 9/11 attack.
So, go ahead.
It was a collegial group. It brought us into contact with a lot of national creditor representatives, there weren't that many. Ricardo Kilpatrick from the Detroit area was one. And we found that a lot of these people were reasonable people. But they weren't calling the shots either.
Mhm.
So in Washington, what we found from working with Johnny Rowski, he told us Senator Dick Durbin, who was a member of
Oh,
the
yeah.
Judiciary
This is going back
Committee,
to the summer of '98.
he said, he's a key person.
Well,
And
which
Senator
we knew.
Grassley had talked to Senator Durbin and said, why don't you co-sponsor this bill with me? And we'll come up with something more moderate than what the House has and what Siner has. And at the end of the day, it'll be fine. And so we had worked with Durbin's assistant, Victoria Bassetti, all summer, not getting very far because
Right.
there were constraints on what she could do or what Durbin was willing to do. And when we told him these were the worst things out there, and she said, well, I don't think he's going to support that. End of the day, the House passed their version. It went to conference, I think.
Yeah, it was in conference in the
And-
summer.
And Durbin went to Grassley and said, well, you remember your pledge you were going to work with me to fix, and Grassley basically backed away.
Okay, so no, but there was more to it than that. We hired John, and we were faced with this conference report coming out imminently. And so John said, okay, you guys we need to go in and talk to Durbin. So he got us an appointment with Durbin, and the three of us went in and we sat around and we talked with Durbin. I'm not going to say part of this, but anyway, I gave the nice pitch about, you know, how we appreciated all the work that his staff had put into it and blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. Set it up nicely, and how we desperately needed his help to protect the people who had no other protection. You know, we talked a while, and then there was a coffee
Yep.
table. He put his fist down and he said, you know, I'm going to help you. And he killed the bill
Well,
in conference.
What happened is when he went back to Grassley to pull in his commitment to moderate this, it wasn't there. And,
Yeah.
and so Durbin just killed it. And it didn't
Yeah,
even
he
come
killed
up
it.
for, the conference report didn't get through the Senate because Durbin spoke for the Senate and said, we're done. And from that point on, Dick Durbin was and still
Yeah,
is a tremendous
really
ally of
good ally.
families going through bankruptcy
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
country.
Well, the legislation has a lot of twists and turns, and we don't have time to
No,
go
we
through
don't.
them all.
That was the
but-
first one that just to survive that one,
Yes,
though.
But it took, you know, another 2 or 3 sets of hearings.
Yeah.
And finally, it passed in, what, 2005?
March. Was it March?
I
April?
won't go through many of the twists and turns, but I think it's worth noting for the historical record how much chance or fortune or history intervened to prevent the bill from going through. By the end of 2000, the bill had enough momentum to pass, and it was a very bad version of the bill from our perspective. By then, Bill Clinton had gone through an impeachment. Among the allies that he needed to get were folks like Jerry Nadler, and the people that really saved his presidency were mostly our strongest supporters. So there had been a little bit more communication. We heard from our champions that when they had the opportunity to get the presidents here, they talked about our bill. At the same time, Hillary Clinton, then First Lady, had been lobbied very heavily by Brady Williamson. Brady became
Well, also by Elizabeth
and by
Warren.
Elizabeth Warren.
She sought out advice from Elizabeth Warren. They had a good relationship.
And I remember Brady got a meeting with Hillary's chief of staff shortly before the end of that term. And we went in there and we made our case about why the president should oppose this bill. And Hillary wrote an article that appeared in some syndicated column about that this bill was too harsh and unfair, didn't help child support recipients.
Yeah.
And Clinton, in the final days, pocket vetoed the bill. So we were facing sudden death, and he wouldn't sign the bill. But we entered the new Congress with a President Bush, a strong supporter of the industry, an unfriendly Congress, and a difficult road ahead of us. Not only was it made troublesome by the Republicans, one of the chief Democratic supporters of the bill was Senator Joe Biden. Joe Biden
Yeah.
from Delaware, home
Home
state
of
of many
MBNA.
of the credit card
Et cetera, et
companies.
cetera.
He was a champion of the bill.
Yeah,
Was put us, and as senior member of the Judiciary Committee,
Yeah.
put us in a terrible position.
right.
They had scheduled a markup in Senate Judiciary as early as September 12th, 2001, to mark up the first version of this. And of course, 9/11 happened, and that went by the wayside. By the time the country started to get back on its feet, this had been put on.
Which of course was also going through another terrible recession.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right, right.
But everything paled in significance at that moment. But it happened to stop that hearing from taking place. By the end of 2001, Trent Lott, then Majority Leader, was ready to bring the bill up. And Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota, who was a supporter of our position, told the leaders on both sides, Tom Daschle, who was from South Dakota, another credit card friendly
Right.
state, that if they brought this bill up, it was going to cost them at least 2 weeks on their legislative calendar, because he had something to say about
He
it.
was gonna
So
filibuster.
Trent Lott didn't want to spend the time, and he did bring the bill up. By the end of 2002, I think that was the year that they thought they could get the bill through. It was the year. We had a provision in the bill that was going to protect, or was going to preserve non-dischargeability claims against perpetrators of violence against people using abortion clinics, family planning clinics. And that amendment that had passed the House Judiciary Committee had been sponsored by then House member Chuck Schumer. And Schumer was then a senator for New York. And you could call it the poison pill. And we said,
You
they
have
don't
to
care
do
about
certain
consumer
things
debtors.
when you're fighting a bill.
Listen, we have to have something in that bill that makes the supporters think twice about voting for
I
it.
had a whole chart of different
Yeah.
things, different amendments.
So we asked for an abortion clinic violence non-dischargeability provision to be put in the bill. And with our lobbyists and with our supporters, Senator Shulman put that through. And that plugged up the bill for a long time.
Yeah.
Because what it did is it divided the two biggest constituencies of supporters on the Republican Congress, which was the business community, which wanted this bill, and their grassroots religious community, who didn't want anything out there that would be punitive for people protesting abortion. So that political issue, which is far removed from almost anything we'd ever seen, although there was a case where a clinic violence perpetrator had gotten a discharge, which was another poster child that we used. That helped us tremendously, because the Republicans tried to ram through the bill at the end of the 2002 and they lost in the House because a Republican